created to have some fun together, sharing and singing. So, join and enjoy.
Our love for opera brings us together. Thanks for being with us in this trip.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for listening to us. Today we have another program on the Centennial of Maria Callas. But before we jump into today's content, I wanted to share with you a very lovely message that we got from one of our listeners. We have a message from the young mother Estefania. She's sharing with us. She has two lovely boys, Matthias, 5 years old, and Enzo, 2 years old. They have been listening in the past to the previous programs on this series of the podcast, and the message that really melted my heart, and I just shared it with Sophia. Sorry, I haven't shared with you. Sophia is back with us again. Sophia Lampton, the writer, the author of a recent book on Maria Callas. We are going to give a couple of minutes to talk of her book again at the end of the program. But I was just sharing with Sophia that it really melted my heart when Stefania wrote me and shared that Matthias asked her to put the opera program on Spotify. I mean, that's the kind of things that really makes me believe that this effort is worth it, because the new generations are the future of our world. We will have a new generation of musicians, artists, scientists, sport people, and maybe Matthias and Enzo will build. And I really hope they will build the best possible future of their in their lives. And I wanted to thank you for sharing with us this time, for loving at least what you have learned so far from these opera programs, and of course to invite you to keep listening to us. Sophia, on your side, is there something that you would like to say to Matthias and Enzo?
Um, yeah, keep listening to Opera We Love Singing and keep listening to music in general. You'll find it's a very easy connection to make with music from a very young age.
Yeah, and we hope that so far I think they are the youngest listeners of our program, because 5 and 2 years it's hard to beat. But of course, if you keep writing those email to us, remember it is operawheelofsinging@gmail.com, operawheelofsinging@gmail.com. And there is something else that you would also like to share with us. Remember that this project is about what we love most. In our case, opera, and that is why we used when we created this series. And I was talking with Katia. We said that we needed to include the word love as the name of our program, because love is what best describes the emotions that we have and when we listen to beautiful music. And today's program, the fourth program on Maria Callas in this centennial, this anniversary of her birth, we are going to address a very interesting topic that I really enjoyed a lot preparing and working on it. And I know Sofia enjoyed it as well. We are going to talk about Maria's repertory in French, or French repertory, which I would like to start with. Um, because I think that for clarification purposes, and you might be aware that in the what is called the golden years of opera and up to the 1950s, many, even if the composer was French, many of those operas were performed in Italian or in another language. So you can find versions of Carmen, of Werther, and even Rossini's Guillermo Tell, the original is in French, Guillaume Tell. You find them in Italian. Personally, I do not like that, because there is a lot that you lose when you change the language. There is a metrics, there is intonation, there is accent that cannot be put in the new language that you are using to sing. So we are going to refer to the repertory from French composers that Maria Callas sang, most of them in the studio. We will give details on that. So keep that in mind. We will not be talking about cases as Donizetti, you know already, Italian composer, but who liked to compose in French as well. The case of La Fille du Régiment, for instance. And we also have cases when it is not actually a French composer, but whose creation was better known in that language than in the language of the composer. That would be the case of Gluck. Everybody knows that Gluck was, of course, not French, but that could be another case. I don't want to get into much detail of it. Just wanted to make that clarification because you will notice that some of the areas that we will mention ahead are either in Italian or there is a version in Italian and there is a version in French. We are referring to French composers trying to adhere to the French language as well. And maybe to start with the topic, Sophia, we can talk about the fact that Maria Callas decided, even though she sang some of these pieces in her early 50s, truth is that she started working more on the French repertory, maybe if we are allowed to say it this way, at the final or the second stage of her career. In the beginning, she was too much into bel canto, mainly Normas, some Verdi, some Puccini, mainly Bellini. So French was not really part of her in the beginning. She decided to go for it later, and for me, it is unfortunate that she decided to take it uh, in the second or the later stage of her career because we learned from her Italian performances that she really understood the language. She knew what syllable to put to emphasize, where to use an accent. And unfortunately, that is not the case for all her French versions. My thoughts are that mainly because she was not that familiar with the language. In your book, you also make a reference to that she asked for advice on the pronunciation. And pronunciation is just the very first step, but you have complete long phrases. But what are your thoughts on this Maria Callas sharing with us her renditions on the French repertory?
Well, on one hand, she didn't sing French repertory throughout the peak of her career, which was the mid to late 50s. But as we discussed right before this recording, that didn't seem to be at all encouraged at La Scala, where Italian opera and opera in the Italian language was of paramount importance. But she did sing French opera by herself just for fun when she was a girl. So when she was around 11 years old, she would pace around her room singing either the habanera or the aria from Mignon, and she would alternate between those two, maybe because she was actually learning French at school. So she became acquainted with the French language long before she became acquainted with the Italian language. She learned Italian only when Elvira Hidalgo. When she met Elvira Hidalgo that she could learn it in 6 months, and she started to learn it in Athens during the war by conversing with Italian soldiers. But as you correctly point out, it is a very different language, and she herself recognized that. And that's why when she was recording Carmen, even though that was actually already over 3 years after her first French record, which was called, what was it? It's been retitled several times, and I have it as Callas à Paris 1, but I think originally it was just called Callas Sings French Arias, and then there was one disc and there was another compilation disc, and she would tell Maestro Prêtre to correct her pronunciation if it sounded too Italian. And what she later told a Juilliard student, Pamela Hebert, was that the stress is different. So if you take the air de lettres from Werther, if you were to sing it with Italian stress, it would be Qui m'aurait dit la place que dans mon cœur. Now that's what I heard Callas say, and I understand what she's saying. I understand what she's saying, but I'm not a singer myself, but I feel like in some phrases in the French repertoire, she does use more of an Italian emphasis, because she herself told Pamela Hebert, if you're singing in Italian, you're chopping it up a bit in terms of stress, where you place the stress. But if you're singing in French, it's more the whole phrase. And sometimes I think she makes that when she sings the French repertoire, sometimes she doesn't. And I wonder, well, my feeling is it's also to do with her nerves a lot of the time, because as we'll later discuss, I don't want to downplay her performances, because there are some unbelievable incarnations, especially in the more mezzo repertoire. But when she was singing live in this period, when she was doing concert tours, and she sang the habanera several times, and she also sang Pleurez mes yeux several times during a single concert in 62, she would get very, very nervous sometimes, and sometimes she would just actually not sing the text. Sometimes she would make it up, or sometimes she would sing the next phrase or the two phrases before. So that was embarrassing. And when you're nervous, of course, French is it's a less phonetic language than Italian. So Italian is much more what you read sounds like what you expect it to sound. French, most consonants at the end of words aren't pronounced, but some are. And there's also something called elision, where the last consonant of a letter is only pronounced if it's followed by a word beginning with a vowel. I'm a French tutor as well as being a writer, so this is what I teach my students. And it is harder, and especially if you're nervous, it's probably harder to create a good diction when performing that. So I would say her diction is better when she is more comfortable. And unfortunately, because her voice has already degenerated somewhat by 61, and then, even more as we get into 64, her diction is better when the notes are lower, which sounds a bit like a huge generalization, but that's my observation.
And it is true that the French repertory is a specialty repertory for singers. You can be a great singer. We have talked about you can be a Wagnerian singer, you can be a Verdian singer, an Italian singer for bel canto. But if you want to sing French repertory, first advice, learn the language. Really, you're not going to get away with it with only the pronunciation, because what Sofia just shared with us, it is very important. If you say qui m'aurait dit de la place, qui m'aurait dit de la place, doesn't mean anything, even if it is pronounced like that. But if you put the right stress, qui m'aurait dit de la place qu'il occupe aujourd'hui, the way the French language is built, for many people, it is a very beautiful language. Uh, but it is special the way you put the stress, the rhythm, how many syllables you say in one single phrase. It's different. It's challenging, and moreover, the pronunciation. In previous programs, we have talked about it. I recall a program with Katia when we talked. We know that the French language is nasal in nature. And one of the main mandates of a singer is to avoid nasalization. So there is a clear contradiction, because technique tells you that you cannot nasalize so that you can project the voice, but on the other side you have a language that is naturally nasalized. So there are sounds that will not come clear unless you know how that actually works. And there are many singers even now that get away with it with a lousy pronunciation of French. Prior to this recording, we were talking about Pourquoi me réveiller? And the ending, réveiller ends in e, réveiller. But if you listen to many tenors, they say réveiller. Pourquoi me
Oh, do they?
réveiller? Yeah, yeah, instead of yeah, 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 which is absolutely horrible for people who speak French. I mean, my mother
Mm.
language is Spanish. Whenever I listen to
Hmm.
a recording of a singer who says he's singing in Spanish, and I notice they committed something horrible in my language, instead of saying thank you for singing in my language, it really makes me mad, because I say, man, if you're going to sing in my language, at least study it. At least do your
Yeah.
best in understanding your language you're doing. And there are not many singers who can actually do a good job in French repertory, we will give more
Yeah,
details on how
Ricardo,
much.
I'd like
Yeah.
to share since you mentioned Spanish, because this is a good point. I'm half Russian. So most of the singers I hear on stage singing in Russian are not Russian. Uh, and uh, it does sound funny because you know that Russian is even harder for someone who doesn't speak it than French. Um, and I won't get into details because I know this is about the French repertory, but I know of a very funny anecdote where an opera coach who taught singers how to sing in Russian, taught them Russian diction, deliberately pranked one of them by telling a singer to sing a swear word instead of the actual word in the Queen of Spades. So instead of saying pass by, I don't know, please, he said a swear word, which was very funny. So I won't get into that, but it's a problem when singers don't know what they're singing, which is not the case of the Callas French repertory because she did know what she was singing, she knew what it meant. But yeah, even if you do know what it's singing, if your diction is not clear, it will become apparent to people who are familiar with the French language or any given language.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing this up because we will be remarking it very often in this program. We are not talking about just singing in French.
Mm.
It is French repertory. It is a specialty repertory where you really need to have a very clear idea on where you are going, where you are allowed to make that liaison that you just mentioned. Does it make sense? Why am I emphasizing it differently? Because that's what really makes the difference when singers are singing French. And why don't we start now talking about her roles? I would like to start with what I call the lyrical roles. For people who are familiar with opera, you know that we can at some point classify the voices of our sopranos. We will have this classification into lyrical roles, the coloratura roles, and what I call the heavier roles, usually spinto or dramatico. For the lyrical roles, and let me make a small pause there. A lyrical soprano singing French is not the same lyrical soprano singing Italian. You say, if you sing Mimi, you're going to get away with Leila in Le Pêcheur de Perles? No. You're you're singing Puccini and then you're going to get away with Louise? No. I like to say that somehow the French music is so elegant, it's like velvet. The orchestration, the beauty of all the melodies put together that are to me, of course, anyone can compare it to whatever if, it makes sense to you, but for me, it's velvet. So in the case of Leila in Comme autrefois, when she starts singing Comme autrefois, tra la 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 la, this is such a delicate melody that really carries you away. Don't know if you listening to the program have ever tried it. Try to put Comme autrefois, Leila's aria, uh, maybe 8 p.m. drinking some tea or drinking a glass of wine and just listen to that. Try that experience. Silence at home and just listen to the very beautiful melody of Bizet. That is the area Comme autrefois. And unfortunately, from my perspective, in more uh, unfortunately, even though Maria was a genius in understanding the dynamics of music, and she does it very well in Italian, unfortunately, I don't think she achieves that level of understanding in the French repertory because she could dissect the Italian arias to perfection, understanding what syllable to emphasize, but I feel she falls short in the French repertory. Of course, one can always say that Maria's voice was not the best for these very beautiful lyrical roles, but I know that to compensate the lack of beauty of her voice, she really understood the music. But it was it was just not enough time for her because when I think of what true creation she could have made out of Manon, of Luis, of Margarita, of Leila, I feel like there is something missing. What are your thoughts, Sophia?
My thoughts are really divided between, they're very different for the lyrical coloratura repertoire and the mezzo repertoire, because it must be again repeated, though it's a kind of known fact among Callas fans. But by the time we get to 61, Callas's voice, the top part, is really, it sounds quite fragile. She's finding it harder to support the top register uh, for various reasons. Firstly, there was that vocal decay that began all the way back in 57. And one can argue there are different reasons for that. And I'm not going to get into that in particular. It's just something we observe. Okay, so in 57, she's already having some struggles with her top notes. So she's got that wobble in the higher register. That is getting worse through 58 and through 59. But at the same time, from 57 to 58, it's more of a lottery. One day she sounds glorious, and the next day the top register is struggling. It was always that case for her in general, because that's what happens to performers. One day you sound great, the next you don't. But she has this defect from 57 that does get worse. And then in 61 also she had sinusitis. And eventually she would find out she had a hernia not far from, she said it was next to her appendix, but she had appendicitis. So she also said it was close to the diaphragm. So it's hard to know exactly where it was, but that was also affecting her singing. We don't know if she already had it by this point, but she would eventually have it and have an operation for it in January 63, shortly before recording the second French Arias album. However, we're starting off with Leila and Les Pêcheurs de Perles, and as far as we know, she didn't have a hernia at this point, but she did have vocal problems and she did have sinusitis. And if we're talking about this aria in particular, I listened to this and I felt this every time I've heard it, which must be, I don't know, at least 40 times between I don't know, 14 years ago and now. To me, I hear a very self-conscious Callas when she performs this aria. I feel like she is singing c'est lui, and she's thinking, how am I gonna do a crescendo on the top note? And I think you made a more of a generalization about Callas in the French repertory. I think she would have performed it in a sterling fashion had she felt more vocally sure of herself in this period. But the combination of various insecurities, including, well, I was going to talk about including the fact that people would say she has lost her high register because she's a mezzo, but right now we're not talking about a mezzo role. But just the fact that she was already very insecure at this point. And I don't know how much she felt that by dipping into some mezzo roles together with lyrical soprano ones, she was compromising what she wanted to do or what she felt she could do, because it is a change. So she is going into this new experience with a slight feeling of, I'm having to do this, as opposed to, this is a new excursion for me in my career. This is a new adventure that I'm doing because I can do anything, because I've accomplished so much. So I do think when we are talking about the more difficult for her in that period repertoire, it is affected, unfortunately, by it. And the diction in Comme autrefois, Dans la nuit sombre, sounds a little bit messy, and I can hear her breath struggling. And I feel like I hear her planning, okay, I'm going to take a larger breath here to secure that high note. And still, unfortunately, some of them come off quite strained, and it's difficult. As you said, this is a sensuous aria that is meant to sound very elegant. So when you're hearing trouble in it, it sounds, dissonant for the music.
At some point, the French repertory, moreover, when you talk about composers like Gounod, Berlioz, Bizet, Charpentier, there is this thing in the French composers that somehow is similar to Mozart, that when you play a note out of place, you immediately notice. In the French
Yeah,
repertory, the voice melts so well with the orchestra that exactly when a high note or a note is strident, you immediately notice because the voice is not homogeneous enough. And I think that maybe she went a little too far because I was sharing with you that the voice of a soprano, a lyrical soprano who engages in French repertory is different to Italian because Italian, the vocal technique for singing opera falls pretty well in the Italian repertory, but it does not fall that well into the French because in the Puy le Jour and in Leila's aria, in both areas, they have to do something, and it is better, if you allow me to say it this way, it is better to have a smaller voice like Victoria de Los Angeles, if you know the Spanish, this very great Spanish
hmm
soprano, Victoria de Los Angeles, had a much smaller voice, but that falls perfectly into Leila's or any other French role because her voice is small. She doesn't need to take out the pasta that Callas needs to make in the high notes because her voice is so wide for these roles that she has to work to make it sound delicate. And that effort of taking out the pasta
but does
to
that affect the breathing?
let
Do
me
you
see
think
if I
that's a
let me
problem
see
because
if I
it affects
can
the breathing?
it is difficult for me because I am a spinto voice, so I have the same problem there. But for instance, let me see. Let me think of a part of comme autrefois. La, 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 la. You see, la. I have to make my voice sound thinner than it actually is. And Callas had to do that as well. The thing is that she was already carrying out with problems. When your voice is complete, you can take that out and you say la 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 la. Because if you sing it complete, it would sound like la 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 la, and you immediately notice the difference. You see how wide the voice is. So she had to take that pasta out so that she would sound delicate. And where your voice,
But isn't that an advantage for her because she's struggling with the high notes? So I actually thought she was using that to mask defects. Because
it
if
is.
you
It,
innuendo it, it's harder to notice strain. Whereas you
I have
sing
been
it at
also
key two.
thinking that it also has to do with the position of her resonators, because I think
Mm-hmm.
she's singing. Well, the vocal technique is difficult to explain, so I will try to put it easier. Uh, the way you place your voice for singing is in a given area, right? So when you sing
Yes.
la 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 la, but that in my case you see la 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 closer to falsetto is not my natural
Mm-hmm.
sound. When your voice is complete, you can do that. Tra la la tra la la tra. You see, you put the pasta in and out because you still have your voice. When you don't have it, you cannot make that switch. And that's what Maria was struggling with. If her voice had been complete as in the early 50s, she could have done it better. But
Yeah.
since she was already struggling because she had a problem reaching the high notes, so the resonators, what we call la voce di testa, was not working as she expected.
Mm-hmm.
So switching back
Yeah.
and forth
But
between
it
those
doesn't
voices,
that her sinusitis also impacted that.
everything
Precisely because she's having a problem with the head voice as because of the sinusitis.
It also it has to do with a lot of things. But by the time she was singing this, we have the expression in Spanish. Not sure if it exists in English or in Italian. In Spanish, we say que la voz está tocada. Tocada means that the voice is already hurt. By
Mm.
listening to a singer when you listen to him, you immediately notice that the voice is already tocada, hurt,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when you hear to Maria. It's not. Yes, she was having those sinusitis, which of course all respiratory problems for singers are crucial or horrible to have. But moreover than that, one by listening to her, one feels that her voice is already hurt. There's a
Mm-hmm.
number of reasons. It could take a different program to work on that, but I think that's what she was struggling with it with. She noticed that in order to sing Depuis le jour, she needed a voice to sound innocent, light, juvenile, and that she needed to place it in a way that she couldn't handle any longer because
Yeah,
the voice
and
was not there.
since we're talking about the resonance chambers, she did say precisely about this first French compilation album, about this period, that because of her sinusitis, my sinus was full of pus and my resonance chambers were not working. And you hear that, and that is why I feel like the 61 arias, so the ones from the first album of French arias, are less successful than those of the second album. And Depuis le jour comes, I'm pretty sure it's from the first album. And yeah, this is a real problem as a performance. It's strident, and she embarks on it with tremendous caution, which is very contrary to what Louise is saying. She's saying my life changed because this wonderful thing happened, and Callas is going into it sounding afraid in an almost muffled, conserved way.
And also, now that we're talking about these roles, I wanted to mention because her recording of Manon, Je marche sur tous les chemins, called my attention because what I like the most is the piece that follows right after that, which is the very famous gavotte, La Gavotte in Manon, taran, taran, tararararan, which is very
Mm-hmm.
beautiful, not only to listen but to watch it on stage. And she decided not to record it, so it took me by surprise that she wanted to go for the first part of Je marche sur tous les chemins,
Yeah,
which
that is strange.
really doesn't have anything. I mean, it's not really an aria that one would keep in his mind. I don't know. It really surprised me that she decided to record that one.
You have a very good point there. Um, I also don't know. Unfortunately, there isn't that much information on the roles she didn't sing completely. Sometimes there is, for instance, with it was I think the Jewel song from Faust that she recorded. I will get to that eventually, but I think it was 32 or 40 times because she felt it wasn't going well. But for Manon, do you want to stay on Manon for the moment?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I don't know why she only recorded Je marche sur tous les chemins and didn't get into the gavotte. I feel like she wanted to do Adieu notre petite table, which I just pronounced as though I was singing Adieu notre petite table, because she felt much more secure in it. Uh, every time I hear her perform this aria, well, especially when she later performed it on French TV, which was May 65. So this is one of her very last performances before the big gap between her performances from 65 to 73. She was very, very nervous. And I just feel like she uses a very soft volume to mask insecurities in the top, which makes sense for the role because she's saying Je ne suis que faiblesse et que fragilité. So it makes perfect sense for her to sing this very, very piano. And that way she is thinning the voice. So as you said, she is getting rid of the pasta, or is she just hiding her faults? I don't know. I suspect both are true. And B, you can, on the other hand, argue if the characterization is emerging, does it really matter if you can sometimes hear, especially if you think of the May 65, the later live TV recording, there are some notes that sound a little bit potentially off pitch, so they're kind of so they're lacking in body so much that they're almost threatening the pitch, and the respiration is strained. But the respiration is strained when she's saying malgré moi, je sens couler mes larmes. I feel my tears flowing in spite of myself. So you know, if you can argue on the other hand, well, when she was singing Violetta, she said she made the voice as thin as a thread because this courtesan was dying from consumption, and critics didn't understand that she was deliberately pacing the breath so that Violetta would sound ill with tuberculosis. It wasn't that she was running out of breath. So now we know, because we happen to have the knowledge, that Callas had severe vocal problems by this point, but a critic shouldn't really be factoring that into an analysis. When you're a critic, you listen or you attend a performance, and all you're analyzing is what happened on this night. So, I mean, I, as a critic, I don't like to factor in a person's entire repertoire or career. I'm interested in what is happening on this evening or sometimes afternoon. And can you not attribute what may be a weakness to actually very good characterization? That, I think, for me, it's entirely subjective. It depends on what mood am I in, because maybe if I've heard a lot of the later Callas recordings and I feel like I've heard a lot of her stridency, I think I don't want to continue listening to Callas in this period. Let me go back to the mid 50s, late 50s. But if it's been a while since I've heard those recordings, I think that's very on point characterization. The fragility is really coming out. And does it really matter if it's Callas's fragility or Manon's fragility? I don't know. I think it's more of a personal preference, because the technique is from, well, I'm just thinking, for the May 65 recording, the technique is good. For the studio recording, which was from June 63, I feel that's less interesting. It's more, she's more self-conscious in it. She's more self-aware. But I always really loved the way she split up, both in the June 63 studio recording and in the May 65 TV recording. That anticipation when Manon is remembering how she and Desgrieux were together, and she remembers qui cherchait les lèvres de l'autre. So they would look for each other's lips. That's, so to speak, that's what she's saying. So they were on the verge of kissing and they'd look for each other's lips. And she really captures that nostalgia for a completely different time. So I don't believe I've ever listened to a performance of hers. Sorry, I kept saying June 63. I think it was a bit later. But there are 3 Adieu Notre Petite Tables. There's a studio recording from 63. There's also a live recording from 63. And they're both quite good. And there's a later one. I think they're all quite good. My favorite one is probably the live June 63 from the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, because it has that tension of it being live, but it's vocally stronger than the later May 65 one on TV. So probably the weakest one is actually the studio recording. So probably the most popular and most heard one happens to be the weakest.
And it was the first one. Not only she was struggling with her technique, but also it was the first time she approached to that area. And if people listening to us are singers, and I know some of them are of our listeners are singers themselves, you know that you mature in a character. So the way you sang it 2, 3, 5 years ago is not the same way you would sing it now. So I think that somehow Maria said, I'm going to correct this and this and this. I am going to emphasize, put this here, put that there, and that's why you notice there is sort of an evolution. Even if the voice is not better, you notice when a singer is more comfortable with a role. And every time it is the first time, every time there is always a first time, right? And the first time is usually not as good. All singers know it.
Yeah.
You perfect a role throughout the years. So it really makes sense to me that even if Maria had had uh, a later recording for the 70s, provided she had had voice to do it, I think she could have rendered a much better rendition because she could have not only understood the role of Manon, but would have been more familiarized with the French repertory. Because I think, and maybe I am putting this comment because I wanted to mention it in the mezzo roles, I think that was the case for Charlotte for the La Scène des Lettres when she was having the
Mm.
Juilliard classes, because the way she
Hmm.
guides the mezzo into that scene for me is very good. But when I listen to
Oh
her
yeah.
rendition, I say, oh, no. I think she
Oh,
didn't
well,
get
I
it.
disagree. We'll have to get to that.
Yeah,
But
we can refer to that later. Yeah, I just wanted to mention it.
yeah.
And before we leave the lyrical roles, we still have to talk about Marguerite, which in fact it is the scene. Il était le roi de Tulé et je veux vivre.
Hmm.
Je veux vivre, a
Yeah.
great favorite of all sopranos. Ta-la-la-la-la-la-la-la, tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la.
Yeah.
And also, uh, these two roles, the two of them from Maestro Gounod, I think you're not pretty satisfied with both Marguerite and Juliette. What are your thoughts on her performing this music?
Which one? Marguerite or
Marguerite
Juliette?
from Faust and
Marguerite. Okay.
Juliette
Um.
later.
Well, interestingly, generally, yeah, I'm not very personally. I am not, as a classical music lover and critic, very satisfied in that I. Well, firstly, I'm a bit biased here because I don't like. No, wait. No, sorry, I was thinking of Juliette for a moment. Okay, back to Marguerite. No, no, I do like Il était un roi de Tulé as an aria. I think it starts off interestingly at a quite comfortable mezzo forte, and then what I'm hearing is Callas feeling quite insecure. Um, the only good thing is her pacing is quite good. So the way she distributes the tempi, her rhythm, possibly because she is taking it at a quite a slow pace. It's quite a slow introduction to the air du miroir, but yeah, I do think that. Well, there is some interesting when we get to the air du miroir. There are some interesting moments of the little girl voice that remind me of Fiorilla in Il Turco in Italia, and there are some very clean arpeggios, uh, but too many notes are strained for me to think that she was having fun with it. And of course, a soprano must have fun with this aria because it's all about vanity and taking pleasure in how amazing you look. And comment n'être pas coquette? How could I not be a coquette? I have to come clean that I have never listened to this aria. No, I think I did when I was 16. I didn't know much about music. I think I remember listening to this aria for fun, but it doesn't occur to me to put on Callas singing the Air du Miroir because I already feel, I hear strain. And also, I know that she was under tremendous pressure in this period. So it's very difficult to remove yourself from that and to just take pleasure in some of its positive attributes because there aren't that many, to be honest. I just don't feel she is comfortable enough to let loose because she's too self-aware of her own of the limits of her high register at that point.
Which, by the way, I wish Maria would have worked on that. If not a live presentation, at least a complete recording on Fast. I think that would have been
Mm.
very interesting to see because again we have to mention that we know that she liked to work on the psychology of the characters, how she would have evolved Marguerite from the very beginning when she meets Faust until the very end at the apotheosis as written by Maestro Gounod, which is a very dramatic, a very beautiful piece of music. I wish I would she would have recorded it at least the studio Because Marguerite, even though all the attention is put into the bass, of course, Mephistopheles and the tenor Faust himself,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
Margherita plays a very interesting role. So for me, it is not only what happens in the first part of Il était and Roi de Tulé, and the sopranos like to call it the Jewels aria.
Yeah, the Jewel song. Yeah.
El área de las joyas, they like to call it. It is of course her most important moment in the opera, but the way she
Hmm.
evolves is very interesting, and I think that would have been a great fit for an artist like Maria. Unfortunately, that didn't
Yeah.
happen, but I
Yeah,
wish
it
she have
really it
done
could
that.
have happened in 55, 56, 57, and then it would have been good. Just like Rosina was pretty good. Fiorilla was pretty good. So it could have happened. I mean, it's not the most interesting role, so I don't know how much you would have enjoyed it. But this is too late for that role for her voice
Yeah, it is too late for
as
her
it
voice.
was then.
Agree, agree. And why don't we move now for the coloratura roles? And we have not those many roles, but it is interesting the selection that she did on the arias that she sang. I'm going to name them because this is going to be the case of the opening of the program. She sang Ombra Ombra Leggera from
Leggera.
Dinora, which in fact is in French and the name is Ombre Légère, but she decides to put it in Italian. She also sings Dov'è l'Indiana Bruna in Italian, where the original
Hmm.
from Lacmé is Où va la jeune Indue, also known as L'air de Clochette. And she sings the mad scene from Hamlet, Ophelia's mad scene, and she sings from Mignon, Je suis Titania. All these pieces, which one would expect to hear in voices like Edita Gruberovas, Nathalie Dessay, Mado Rovin, or Beverly Seals, because these four voices that I have mentioned are more suited to that type of repertory. If you notice, the common point between these four voices is that they are very high in pitch. Look
Yes.
look at Edita, Natalie, Madon, Verly, and they are voices that do not have too much body in the middle and the low registers because
Hmm.
they are high voices. So for a high voice to sing Titania, to sing Ophelia, to sing Lacme, it's very natural. While Maria, her natural pitch was much lower. So she had to, again, this habit of hairs, which many people in Spanish call it calando. Calar las notas means that you are not singing it with your true fully voice. You're just like close to falsetto, doing something wrong, because that is not the natural tone of your voice. And I was wondering if she wanted to show that she could achieve it. Uh, Maybe you could find in here part of the reason why her voice was hurt. Because Amra Légère, Ruva la Jeune Indue, Ophelia's aria, Je suis Titania are very,
They were
very
sung at very
high.
different points in her career.
And
Ombra Leggera comes from quite 54, so it's pretty early, and her voice is in magnificent shape then.
but
And then Je suis Titania, earliest is 58, live recording, Los Angeles, November 58, where it's already slightly tarnished, but not too bad. And then,
but my point
yeah, sorry,
here
go on.
is that she shouldn't even have sung this once.
Oh, I disagree.
I think, and we mentioned it earlier, as in the case of why would you sing Turandot only because you have a high C for the second act? No, because it demands things that you don't actually have. The singer has to be very careful in choosing his repertory because if you're not careful enough, you end up harming your voice. And I think she could have gone ahead with her life perfectly without singing any of these four, because let's be sincere, besides being full of pyrotechnics, Ophelia's and Mignon's aria. It is true that they really don't add much to the art of opera. I mean, we can go move on without having Ophelia's and Titania's. It is not like getting rid of Violetta Valéry, which of course is one of the most important pillars of the opera. But those two, it looks to me, seems to me like she wanted to sing them only to prove that she could sing them, but really doesn't add to her artistically speaking. And she went back to that effect of trying to take away most of the pasta of her voice to try to make it lighter and brighter when her voice really is not that. I read a comment which I found very funny because there is a comment on her Je suis Titania. The comment says
Which
that
one? The live one?
no, I think this is the studio recording on
Oh,
the
okay. So is this the earlier one then? Because I was
and
thinking I just now of the live one, but there is a yeah.
the
It was
comment I
there was
read
also one
is
earlier on.
from, well, I'm not sure. Well, the person who wrote that comment
Uh-huh.
said that this was the first time that she heard Lady Macbeth singing Titania.
Oh, I have to say I disagree here. So if we take apart the different roles, first of all, you have to remember she sang these roles at different times. So if you want to argue that she shouldn't have sung Titania in 58, well, I understand that because she's already having problems. However, the first one, which was a studio recording, that was still from 58. It was 2 months before the live one in Los Angeles in November. This was September 58. There is some caution there, but I think that the glissando is very slick. I don't think she is. I think some of it is still coming quite easily to her. And I think the characterization is very, very interesting. It's a very trance-like display of euphoria. Now I'm confusing. Okay, all right. Was this comment about Titania or this was about Titania, not Ophelia, right?
Not Ophelia.
Okay, all right. So I don't know what I was thinking of. I was thinking of Ophelia. Okay, so if we go back to Titania. Oh, if you're thinking of the 61 recording. Okay, yeah. That doesn't work out, but that is the later Callas voice that is now having problems in all parts of the repertory, including things that came very naturally to her before. And then if we go all the way back to Dinora, I think the Ombra Leggera was fabulous back in 54. And I do think she found it relatively easy then. So I don't think it caused her voice harm. And I would say the same about Lakme. And I think that the effect she gives in Dove l'Indiana Bruna, which is the Italian version of what is the name of the aria
Où va
in
la jeune
French?
indue?
What
Où
is it?
va la jeune indue?
Ah, Où va la jeune indue? Okay. I think there's a tambourine-like sound. I think the trills are exquisite. So when you hear a singer produce near perfect, to me, it's a near perfect performance. So it wouldn't occur to me that had poorly affected her voice. So I think she was capable then. She felt capable and she sang. Yeah, you're right. They're not the most interesting roles, but I do think she produces a very interesting characterization in Lakme because it's a completely different setting for her. Even though it's one aria and it's a studio recording, so obviously we didn't see her in this role even in photos, but this is an opera about Hindus in the British Raj, and she's trying to affect an Oriental flavor, trying to mimic tambourines in a music that is trying to echo something far more Oriental and closer to Indian than anything Maria could ever possibly have sung. So you hear a bit of that in Butterfly in the Japanese kinds of beats, the percussion there, and she's trying to mimic it a little bit vocally in terms of the rhythms and the dynamics. And this is a different spectrum. This is a completely different opera, but I'm very happy that it exists. This recording of ou va la jeune indue. So it's a completely different era of Callas. So we had Dinora and we had Lakme, and then we and Titania. And did you have a comment about Omelette as well?
Yeah, Ophelia's aria, for me, one of the best, if not the best rendition of this aria comes from Beverly Seals. If you listen to Beverly Seals singing this aria, the complete scene, because it's somewhere around 8 minutes and a half, if I remember well, it's super long. And it starts
Mm-hmm.
slow and then goes for the fireworks. For me, Beverly Seals does the best in this area. So when I compare Maria's to Beverly Seals, Maria's version has nothing to do with Beverly's because Beverly's does not need to do anything with her voice. Her voice comes natural to an area like this. And when you compare it to Maria's, you feel that Maria falls short. In moreover, in this Hamlet's scene, and
But again, this is later. This is much later. So we're talking about September 58. She was overworked by this point. So yeah, it's not an optimal performance, but you could equally argue that in 58 there was, so if you're talking about, yeah, that, so September 58, that's the Mad Scenes disc. It's not a most interesting disc, but you could equally argue that there are notes in the Casta Diva later in December 58 in the live Parisian gala that don't sound as secure as they did before. But you wouldn't discourage her from continuing that, or else the 1960 studio recording would never have taken place. So I see what you're saying, but I think it's more to do with the state of her voice in that period than the idea that she should never have undertaken Amlet or Titania. And also, as I said earlier on, she was singing Titania when she was around 11 years old. So she did feel it came naturally to her, at least at that point. And I think it did when her voice was in good condition. But of course, the major problem was that it fell out of condition, firstly little by little, and then more speedily as time went on.
yeah, I think this is one of the. We will not reach a consensus on this one. I will. Let's
Yeah.
move for the mezzo because I really don't think she should have ever sung these roles. Even if you can sing it, if you at some point in your career had the voice to sing it, it doesn't mean that you can sing it and even record it because everything in life of singers eventually affect. But let's move for the very interesting, well, very shortly on the heavy role of from Le Cid, Pleurer mes yeux.
Mm-hmm.
I think, in fact, this was one of the first arias that I heard from Maria in French.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I have to say that I was really, if not shocked, it really caused me a very deep impression. Because the
Mm-hmm.
way the whole aria is constructed is complicated. It's not
Mm-hmm.
easy, beautiful melody like Puccini's, like Massenet's. It's a musical construction that it's interesting from an opera that almost nobody knows, Le Cid. Hardly
Mm-hmm.
someone has ever seen this opera. So this selection of Pleurer mes yeux, because there are opening words, and she says, "De cet affreux combat, je sors l'âme brisée."
Mm-hmm.
De cet affreux combat, je sors l'âme brisée, et enfin je suis libre. And she continues, but that opening, de cet affreux combat, je sors l'âme brisée,
Mm-hmm.
is it's genius the way this
Yes.
Ari opens, and even though one can have one can think that maybe she was not at her peak when singing this. Truth is that for me, at least from a psychological point of view, I think that she understood the role the content on how to evolve, because we go back to the fact that Maria was very good in understanding the dynamics of an aria and where you have to put a crescendo, where you have to do this, where you have to do that. And I think she really does that in Pleurez mes yeux. And it is a
Absolutely.
very hard aria to sing. I can tell you that even sopranos that are now maturing their career could never dare to sing it even in a studio, because this is one of the arias that really puts you in trouble. So if
Mm-hmm.
Maria was not 100% confident in going for one of the hardest arias for a soprano, well, but for me, at least from the psychological and intention and the dynamics of the aria is great.
Yes, absolutely. And there is a lot of darkness musically, but also in the voice. This allows a soprano to delve deep into her chest voice. So I feel like she's much more comfortable in this aria, and you hear it. And then there's a gorgeous diminuendo on Je sors l'âme brisée. So it means I'm emerging with my soul shattered. And you're right. So you if you want to, you can listen and try to pick out her faults. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, if you want to, you can also attribute some of these faults to a psychological state. So when you hear ebbing breath or a diminuendo, you may think, oh, that's maybe too quick a diminuendo. Or, it sounded like it occurred because she was struggling, not because the character was struggling. But I think in the studio recording that she does manage to pass this off as a terrible lament of anguish. Um, even though there is some strained pitch, but again, it's much easier to overlook that, or overhear that, so to speak, than obviously in the arias with more coloratura.
And not only it opens with more spoken of this at Afro-Combat, you have to keep in mind that the aria ends with a phrase, Pleurez mes yeux. It is actually sung,
Mm-hmm.
but it is closer to speaking.
Yes.
Pleurez mes yeux.
Mm-hmm.
And it is
Yes.
not a beautiful melody. It is not Puccini. It brings us these terrible emotions of the singer, which of course Maria knew how to do that. So for me, I think, in fact, that one of the best arias she ever sung is Pleurez mes yeux.
Yes. Yes.
And I think it's now time to talk about the mezzo roles, which are the ones that more people are familiar with, mainly because she went for two of the most important mezzo roles, even not complete, not on stage. Sansone Dalila, of course, who doesn't know about Dalila? Mon cœur s'ouvre à ta voix. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I have said it a number of times. If I had been a mezzo, had been born a woman and
Yeah.
a mezzo, of course I would have loved to sing Dalila. And
Yes.
of course I would have loved to sing Carmen. Even many people don't know it, but there are many sopranos who wish they could sing Carmen. There are a couple of them,
Yes.
like Jesse Norman, who went for Carmen, and the result is horrible.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I don't like Norman's Carmen.
I didn't know Jesse Noah had gone for Carmen, so I'm gonna have to look
Yeah,
that
and
up.
it really is horrible. Her Près des Remparts de Seville. My
Oh,
God.
interesting. I have to hear this. I don't think
Yeah.
I've ever heard this before.
I heard it once and said never again in my life. But why don't we start with? I know we have lots of content on Carmen. Why don't we start?
Leontyne Price also went for Carmen. That was the first Carmen I ever heard, actually, interestingly enough.
Eh,
Did you know that?
no, I didn't know that.
That was my first ever opera recording. My father gave me a recording of Leontyne Price's Carmen. And when when I was little, the first recordings I heard, I thought that's how it's supposed to be done. Because I didn't have any critical thinking because I had nothing to compare it against. I had no point of reference. So then the first time I heard Callas's comment, I thought, oh, I don't like this. This is a dark timbre. I'm not sure I knew the word timbre then, but that was what I was imagining. Of course, I then revised my opinion pretty quickly, but that was my first impression.
And of course, Maria. liked to go big, and that is the case for Carmen because, as I just mentioned, all mezzos would love to be Carmen. Carmen is
Mm-hmm.
maybe the only mezzo whose role could rival to any of the other greatest sopranos.
Well,
Because Carmen is, I mean, to start with, is a very long opera. I mean, it is 5 acts, so it's extensive. And she has, most of the time, Carmen is on stage. She's
yeah.
driving all the opera. Just as Violetta guides Traviata, Carmen guides all Carmen.
Yes, yes, it's a heroine-led opera.
And,
Yes.
and it is very complicated. And I think that not only vocally, because we have to make a separation on the work Maria had to do with the role vocally, but also in the understanding of the role. Because to start with, Carmen is a gypsy.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that Maria has been raised as an Orthodox Greek, right?
Well, it's not, yeah, but it's not really to do with that. No, so firstly, I would like to say if you're going to get into, the callous childhood, I mean, yes, she was raised as Greek Orthodox, I suppose, but she didn't go to church particularly, and during wartime, that it wasn't on her mind. So the fact that Carmen is promiscuous is much less to do with that than Callas's own character, which is that she was a woman who was very old-fashioned. Several people called her a prude, and she said things that suggested that pretty much. She preferred the romantic heroine. So she liked Violetta, she liked Norma. She didn't, she very openly spoke about the fact that Carmen for her behaved like a man. So in those days, the idea of a woman switching from one, between guys quite casually and doing it without any qualms about either her reputation or the morality behind it or lack thereof. Uh, for most people back then, in the 50s and even the early 60s, that was still unless, I mean, how do I put this? So, first of all, if you want to get into why does Callas not relate to Carmen as much as other heroines? Of course, there's a personal reason, which is simply she didn't feel like she could relate to her, could identify with her, behavior, with her attitude to life. That's reason number one. And then also, Callas was not the most well-read person. So if you read not just Mérimée Carmen, but if you read French literature from the 18th and 19th century, also Manon Lescaut by the Abbé Prévost, and also, if you read Maupassant and Flaubert, of course you get acquainted with women who are very free with their sexuality, very, carnally gluttonous, I suppose you can say, or very much at liberty and lascivious and not ashamed. But Callas had not read those novels, and she hadn't been to that many plays. And she hadn't even really watched that many films, to be quite frank. So that's the second reason. Is it's also not very much on in the horizon of her mindset. It's not something that she thinks, oh yeah, that's a common phenomenon, and I don't really want to do it. So she really has to justify it for herself. That being said, uh, should we get into Carmen aria by aria?
I wanted to make a comment. Maybe
Okay.
maybe Carmen was one of the most challenging roles for Maria. Not only for personal
It
reasons,
definitely took years to get together.
vocal reasons, but in the understanding, because even now, and you can find people uh, in YouTube, there are videos on conferences. That is a very good habit of opera houses where they have these conferences or presentations prior to the actual performance. And I have watched some of them, and I think I have studied Carmen for over 10 years, and I keep learning about it. Because the moment I think I have understood Carmen, I read or think of from another perspective, and I say, no, no, Ricardo, you have to revise what you thought it was Carmen. It really was not. You need to view it from a
Oh,
different
okay.
perspective. And I think that challenge, that's part of the genius of Maestro Bizet. Carmen is a very, complex role. Even though you can say, okay, she behaves like a man, but why is that? What is she reflecting? And why is that voice given to a mezzo when typically the star is a soprano? Why giving it to a mezzo? And look at the melodies that uh, Bizet puts in the voice of la mezzo. We are going to talk about also the scene where she reads, Fortune herself.
Yeah.
Uh, how many sopranos have you seen on a stage like Carmen saying "La mort, toujours la mort,
Yeah.
toujours la mort" in very very low register, but she
Mm-hmm.
knows as she reads she's talking about her own death.
Yeah.
No other soprano has done it that way on a stage in any other opera. Many people don't pay attention to that because in the background the other singers are playing ta 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 ta
Yes. Yes.
so there is this very beautiful melody, but Carmen is la mort toujours la mort. To put all that
Yes. So
together is complicated. As Carmen, the way Carmen evolves, it's not because she knows she knows at some point, more in particular in that scene, that she's heading to her own death. Different to Violetta
yes.
Valery, who knows she's dying because of an illness, right? But the other one says, I am going to be myself till the very end, when she says,
Yes,
Don't je
absolutely.
sais, or
Mm-hmm.
laissez-moi passer.
Yes. So I'd like to. I will get to the confrontation and the card scene before that, but I wanted to go through Callas's relationship with Carmen because even though she was reluctant to sing Carmen, very reluctant, she ended up having a relationship with this role because she sang the habanera several times before she recorded the full opera. So she had to perform. She had to study this role. She had to perform parts of this role, not quite as much or as often as Violetta or Norma, but still very, very often when you compare how often she performed various other roles that she may have sung once on stage, or maybe she might have sung an aria from them in one compilation album. So, firstly, yeah, we've already discussed Callas did not like Carmen as a person. She couldn't identify with her. She read Mérimé's novel. She later said she didn't feel as though Bizet's French music reflected the way Spaniards talk. That was her impression. She said she felt in her mind, and this was her stereotyping of Spanish people back then. Spanish people talked very quickly with kind of high pitched voices, and she couldn't relate that to the mezzo, the dark mezzo of Carmen. So, what she did in the beginning, in some of her earlier Habanera renderings, firstly, it's interesting that she even sung Habanera in her early 60s concerts because you kind of think, why? I mean, I have to, full disclosure here, I'm not a big fan of Carmen. I don't really like it. Of course, I recognize it has good music, but I really dislike the Habanera, maybe just because it's so often used. And unfortunately, if we're talking about the most of the public that doesn't go to the opera and that doesn't listen to opera for pleasure, a lot of people can only name Carmen. And anyway, those are just my personal preferences. Um, so what she did was she sung the habanera as almost this funny song, as, oh, look at love, it's so deceptive, it's like a bird. And I think that in her earlier concerts, especially in March 62 and in November 62, these were filmed concerts, so you can look them up on YouTube. I think these were disastrous performances. She had her hands on her hips, sometimes both, sometimes one of them. She was doing clownish eye expressions that just it looked very vaudevillian. It didn't look like opera. She also confused the words several times, which is quite noticeable in the Habanera just because it's a very popular aria. I remember at school, my music class, we learned the words to the Habanera, I think, when we were in year 8, which is the US equivalent of 7th grade. Uh, when, all of us were far too young to be able to relate to Carmen for sure, if we ever would. But so when you hear Maria Callas muddling up the words to the Habanera, it sounds worse than if she had muddled up the words in Parsifal. You notice it much more easily. And I don't think she's at ease in the March 62 and November 62 recordings. I don't think the characterization comes off well. It's more of a forced performance. It doesn't help that she forgets the word, and she's obviously aware of it. And I, I would like to say this to the Callas loving public out there, because I'm pointing this out because if you go on YouTube and you type in Maria Callas, obviously YouTube returns the most popular results because that's the nature of the internet, and especially YouTube and Google owns YouTube, so there's a reason for that. The most popular Callas recording is Callas singing the Habanera in March 62 in Hamburg Live in a sweetheart neckline dress with a very, very 60s bob haircut. And it has 28 million views. And I have to tell the Callas loving public out there, of course, if people listening, if you do think this is an amazing recording and you've heard all the other Callas recordings of the French rolls and the Italian rolls and all her other recordings and you love it, sure, okay, I understand and respect your opinion. But if you are a Callas newcomer or if you've only heard a few arias, don't judge her on the basis of this performance. It is not good. I don't think she's comfortable doing it. It is technically very dubious and it's characteristically pretty much void. However, she had been goaded to sing Carmen for several years. So Thomas Beecham had wanted to sing Carmen with her and she'd said, no, I don't think my French is good enough. And I won't risk she actually said, I won't risk some damn fool saying that I've lost my top and I'm now a mezzo. And then she would say, well, my legs are too ugly for Carmen, which, is silly from any perspective. So finally, she was persuaded to do it for a studio recording in 1964. Visconti also wanted to stage it with her, and Rudolph Bing, who was the manager at the Met, also wanted to stage it with her in a production by Visconti. They tried to get her to do it, thinking about it for 65, 66, 67. It didn't happen. But when she did finally have to record Carmen, possibly because, yes, she was feeling much more comfortable in her lower register at this point. So it was much easier for her than it was easier for her compared to other roles, and she could no longer do fresh recordings of La Traviata or Il Barbiere di Siviglia. That wasn't going to happen at this point. She did explore the character, and what I really treasure about the complete studio recording, is that she channels Carmen's lust for power and for having the lead in any dialogue, especially with Don José, but also generally among the cigarette girls as well, and in the cards scene. So something I found really interesting was that she's reading the cards. She's the one who's going to die. And she really dives into the underbelly of her really below C dark mezzo, almost a contralto tessitura. And she sings encore, toujours la mort. And she guides it through a gorgeous portamento that toujours la mort. I can't sing it. I'm not a singer. So I'm not displaying it properly. But it sounds like she is bossing them around. It sounds like she's saying, okay, I'm going to die, but I'm going to take it head on. And I don't care what you think, because I'm still stronger than you. And I'm brave enough to face death at the hands of Don José, which is very ironic because, I mean, if you read the story, it sounds like, well, this is a terribly sad opera. Don José kills her in just a moment of insanity because, okay, she wouldn't be his. She went on to Escamillo, but so what? She wasn't his wife even for that time. It's crazy. But if you listen to it, it sounds like she is getting to have the last word, even though she's the one stabbed to death.
Yeah, the way it evolves is very interesting. As I was telling earlier, it's been around 10 years that I have studied this opera, and I keep discovering things. And I think, yeah, Carmen has to be bossy. First thing, because she knows who she is, but she also knows that she is poor, and she lives the way she wants to live, and she will be coquette to whoever she wants to flirt, right? And she falls for Escamillo, and she somehow portrays a woman that is very authentic to herself.
Mm-hmm.
That is easy? No. By the way, the role of Don Jose I detest. This is a tenor role that I detest the most. He's
Yeah.
way too weak. Too weak.
And La Fleur que tu m'avais jetée is just such a ridiculous aria. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm
Oh, wait,
sorry.
wait, wait.
Sorry to all the lovers of La Fleur que tu m'avais jetée. I just find it a really boring aria. Same with Micaela as well.
With the
You
only
know,
difference that the area
je
from
dis que
Micaela is
rien ne me
beautiful.
représente. Everyone seems like a caricature compared to Carmen, who seems like the most powerful woman in the universe.
And the way her color evolves, because opposite to what happens in La Traviata, where her the third act has to be sung with a voice that projects that you're actually about to die. Carmen ends up even yelling in a confrontational
Mm,
scene where I know that I am going to die, but I am going to die because I have decided to.
yes,
We go back
yes.
to Oh, frappe-moi donc, ou
Pour
laissez-moi
laisser-moi
passer,
passer.
which of course
Yeah.
has to be is difficult. I understand it for a soprano because it falls in the range where you have uh, to put
It's
enough support,
parlando.
quasi parlando, yeah, and you have to put much of the chest support because if you try to do it with the
Mhm.
head voice, will never work. You will sound like a
Oh, no.
child yelling "Laissez-moi passer," and no, it has to be
That would be funny.
"Laissez-moi passer."
Yeah.
That moment that is very, very, very difficult because also keep in mind that the singer has been singing for a couple of hours already opposite to dying like Violeta at the end, Moyo Pam, then she falls.
Hmm.
Carmen is to be stabbed on stage.
Yes.
So, sometimes even Carmen runs or passes or puts a part on Jose until she's stabbed. So you see how
Yeah.
Traviata or she dies like this while Carmen is going like this in drama, reaching the
Hmm.
peak of drama. That's what makes it so difficult. And I think that if we had had Maria singing for longer, I think that if she would have gone for a Carmen in the 70s, provided she had had a voice, of course,
Mm. In
it
the 70s, though, I'm not sure about the 70s. It was really, unfortunately, it was too late at that point for her to.
yeah.
We don't know how if she could have carried a whole opera in the 70s, because judging by the recordings, the pirate, not always pirates, some of them are pirates, some of them were legitimate, but the recordings of the 73, 74 concerts, there were some that are really, really bad, unfortunately, and she didn't even have that many arias to sing, and she was also alternating with Giuseppe Di Stefano, and also sometimes if Di Stefano was absent, with the pianists, the accompanists, interludes. So I don't
Yeah.
know about the seven, but I think 65, 66, sure, it could
Yeah.
have worked out.
And since we're running out of time, I would have loved to talk more about Carmen, but we also need to talk about Dalila, Sansone Dalila, the
I did it. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. I was going. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
yeah, because now the same way the habanera is the most well-known aria for a mezzo, same is Mon corps s'ouvre à ta voix, which is a very, very, very beautiful melody. And I think
Yeah.
Maria does fairly well on the arias for Dalila. Not,
I
not
think
to,
she does sumptuously.
the problem here is that Dalila is a much lower voice than Carmen.
I don't think that's a problem here.
And
Do you think that's a problem?
because it is usually
Well,
sometimes
usually,
when
yeah.
mezzos don't feel comfortable enough for Dalila, contraltos go for Dalila because
Sounds like a
of
good
the
idea to me.
texture of the voice for mezzos for contraltos is much easier to sing Dalila, so that Maria ventured to sing one of the most emblematic roles, this case of a biblic role. I find it very interesting. What are your thoughts on how she does with Dalila?
Well, we touched on Callas's French diction before, and we didn't discuss it in terms of Carmen. But I will add about Carmen that for the most part, her French diction is very, very good. There are a couple of places where I feel like she might be singing in an Italian way, but we're on Samson Dalila now, so okay. This, I feel, these arias, so Amour vient de ma faiblesse, Mon cœur s'ouvre à ta voix, and
Printemps qui
Printemps qui
commence.
commence. Yeah. I feel like this is by far the best example of her French diction and her French enunciation and the stress, especially when she can feel comfortable enough to take it as slowly as she does with Printemps qui commence. Every time she leans on the vowel sounds, and the vowel sounds that could be that are in spoken French, they're nasal, so they're quite risky for the singer. But Printemps qui commence, portant l'espérance aux cœurs amoureux. And now, en vain je suis belle. And she leans on it in such a languorous way. Dalila is much more sexual than Carmen. Of course, hypothetically, a mezzo could sing Carmen, emphasizing the sexuality more than what Callas saw as the virility, the masculinity, the power hunger of the role. But Dalila is musically far more sexual. Her goal is to seduce Sanson, and I think Callas really conquers this amazingly. And unfortunately, none of her onstage roles let her exude that kind of sexuality. And it wasn't, again, I don't think, unfortunately, I don't have any commentary from Callas on the role of Dalila, on the character, but I don't think she related to it. I think she just had stupendous musicality that heard that in the music and replicated it in the voice. At the same time, we know that she's on a mission, and it's not merely a case of attraction. She's trying to deceive Sanson. So she is exuding power at the same time, and also eventually some even denigration of this man. So she sings when she and there's this, the k sounds very cutting. She says, he of a people, lui d'un peuple, rompt la chaîne, succombera sous mes efforts. It's a metaphor between he of a people that breaks chains, that shatters chains. He will succumb to my efforts. And that goes down to an A flat below a middle C, and it sounds almost bestial. And it's if you haven't heard this aria, it's possible that you haven't heard that Callas tessitura, that the very, very, very low contralto voice, and you have to hear it because it's nothing like the rest of her range. I think it's absolutely perfect. Maybe, I mean, this is speculative, but maybe it's also because she loves the music so much. And yes, it doesn't go high, and there's no coloratura. She loves doing the portamenti from one note to another. I think all three arias are magnificent.
Yeah, the portamenti, as you just mentioned, we know that Maria learned that from bel canto because portamenti is one of the keys of bel canto. She only had to apply it to this role. So it's no surprise to me that she did that well. I find that she also feels more comfortable. Maybe the music by Saint-Saëns is more comfortable for her more than Bizet. Maybe, we don't know. But I think that she should have sung those, at least Mon cœur s'ouvre à ta voix, in her concerts rather than the habanera. I also think the habanera is not
Oh,
her
absolutely.
best, and but this is the point that you mentioned earlier that she didn't want to be seen as a mezzo.
Yes.
So that must have crossed her
Unfortunately,
mind. Yeah.
absolutely. That was her own problem. And it's very unfortunate because even if someone is thinking you're a mezzo, but that's not preventing that listener from thinking you're an amazing singer. You know, this is her own issue with her struggle to believe that mezzos are equal to sopranos, which sounds insane, but that's the Callas mindset, and you couldn't do anything about it at any stage in her life, really.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we have run out of time.
But we
Again,
didn't do Werther.
we couldn't talk about Werther. We couldn't talk about Je
No,
perdu
I
mon
have to mention
Eurydice.
that uh, uh, listeners out there, if you haven't heard Werther, the Air de Lettres, not the studio recording, so the live one from June 63, you need to look this up on YouTube or wherever you get your music, because the breathing in it, the anguish of Charlotte, who is reading the letter of Werther, who's going to commit suicide, is one of the greatest Callas performances ever. One of the absolute greatest. So, and that's a mezzo aria. And also, just a bit of trivia, it was the last opera she was apparently working on in her entire life. So she had been studying this with her vocal coach, her French vocal coach, Janine Reiss, just 2 days before she died. They were preparing a Werther with Georges Prêtre, who was also the conductor for the French compilation albums and for Carmen. So, listeners, if you aren't familiar with that, do look it up. Don't just automatically assume that if you're looking for a good recording of Werther, you're going through for a mezzo, because it's even though it's not a full recording, it's an amazing execution of the air de lettres, the letter aria.
Yeah, I had never paid attention to that scene until I heard Maria's on that one.
Yes, yes.
Because many mezzos just pass by that scene like, oh yeah, c'est lettre, move on. But Maria, again, with the great artist she was, she could really understand what Charlotte's state of mind was and how she somehow presents that Berther will end up committing suicide. So it really is a very
Yes, it's in
interesting.
the music, it's in the lower strings, it's in the cellos and the tremolos and the music, and she echoes that. And at the end, she says, Tu frémiras, which means you will tremble, and she repeats it. And as she repeats it, it goes lower and lower in the score. And it's extremely eerie. It's extremely eerie and beautiful at the same time. It's unique.
So, to wrap up today's program, I would like to invite people to approach Callas repertory, French repertory. You will find very interesting pieces of music there. You have our comments on those. Of course, you will have your own opinion on what you like the most, and if there is something to dislike, then of course that's what music is about. We all have a preference towards one singer or one composer, and that's what makes us all different. But before we wrap up, I would like to ask Sophia uh, to invite people to buy her book.
Thank you, Ricardo. So, my book, The Callas Imprint, A Centennial Biography, is available on Amazon. If you're in the States, it's available on Barnes & Noble. And worldwide, it's available on Google Books, Apple Books, and Kobo. If you're in the UK, you can also get it on Waterstone's website, W.H. Smith, Boyles, and Blackwell's. So it's pretty available, especially if you're in the US and the UK, but also if you're in any Amazon. If you're in an Amazon territory, you can get the paperback. And if you read ebooks, you can get it almost anywhere worldwide.
With that being said, I would like to thank everyone who have been with us for this fourth program on the Maria Callas Centennial. I hope you all have the best in this. Well, let me share with you that we are recording this in February. So by the time it goes live, it will be printemps in the
Oh, yes,
many
it will.
countries. We are looking forward to live winter ahead.
Printemps qui commence. So the spring that is beginning.
Yeah, Printemps qui commence. With that same name aria from Sansone Dalila, I would like to thank everybody here and hope to see you around very, very soon. Thank you, Sofia.
Thank you for having me, Ricardo. It was a pleasure as always.
We're more than willing to build a community of opera lovers. Please visit our profile at buymeacoffee.com. You can find us as Opera in 1P. Yes, all in one word. opera, then E as in Edward, N as in no, number 1, and P as in Peter. Difficult to catch, right? You can also find it in the description of the episode. We'll be posting there often, so please join us there.